Hi guys, this is Lauren with Lauren Watkins Art, and today I'm going to be showing you how I painted this skull using watercolors. And it's a great tutorial to show you how to layer your watercolors to get vibrant color and how to get this fun illustrative effect using them. So to get started, I transferred my image of a skull onto cold press watercolor paper. You don't have to use cold press, that's just what I'm using in this video. And then I taped it down to a board. The style of painting I'm doing is going to use a ton of water, and so it's really important that my paper is taped down so that it doesn't warp and bend too much. For your convenience, I have my reference photo up in the left-hand corner so that you can see where the highlights and shadows are on my reference photo, and you can kind of follow along as I paint. Now you're probably wondering what I'm doing with the back of this paintbrush, and I am applying masking fluid. So when I did this painting, I hadn't used most of my watercolor supplies in almost 2 years, year and a half-ish, and so I went to go use my normal masking fluid, which is in a squeeze tube, and it had dried out, and then the jar version of masking fluid I had was also really thick and gummy, and so I was applying it the best way I could at that point in time, which was with the back of my paintbrush. Then I let that masking fluid dry, and then I started applying my watercolor. Now, if you've never seen this watercolor before, it is called Brusho. It is a powdered watercolor that you sprinkle onto your paper, and you can apply it to wet paper, or you can apply it dry and then activate it. So I like to do my first layers of these more illustrative styles with the Brusho being sprinkled on and then spraying it, because you get just a really fun washy loose effect, and I find that it just really helps me loosen up and not be so tight in how I'm thinking and how I'm painting. Then I dried that layer, and now I'm going in with more masking fluid, and this is the next day. So I have new masking fluid, and I have a new applicator that I wanted to test out to see if I like it better than my fine line masking fluid applicators or the other techniques I've used to apply masking fluid in the past. So keep an eye out for a new video where I talk about different ways to apply masking fluid. And then as I put down more Brusho and spread the paint around, I dabbed up any color that was in areas that I didn't want it to be. And then I let my paper dry completely. Sometimes I let it air dry, sometimes I use a heat tool to help speed up the drying process. Then once it was completely dry, it was no longer cool to the touch, then I went in with more masking fluid. So this process is very like building in layers. So I put down masking fluid, let it dry, did a layer of paint, let that dry, did another layer of masking fluid, let it dry, and so on and so forth. This is a fine line masking fluid pen. It has like a needle, a hollow needle at the end of it that allows you to get really precise applications of masking fluid down. And if you are still confused what masking fluid is, it's like a liquid rubber that you can apply to your paper, and it protects anything underneath it. That makes it so you can apply water and paint all over the top of it, and anything underneath that masking fluid will be protected. Now, two things to keep in mind when you are painting in this style. One, I am using a staining paint. So Brusho stains your paper. Oftentimes in watercolor, you can have colors that lift really easily. They tend to be more of your granulating colors, and then you have colors that tend to stain your paper. And so it doesn't matter how much you re-wet your paper, that paper is going to be dyed at least a little bit. And we're using that in our favor for this project because we're adding so much water on top of it, we're layering so much on top of it, we're putting masking fluid on top of layers of paint. We want that paper to be stained to some degree because then we're not going to have our layers mixing too much on the paper. That is also why I use so much masking fluid, because I can't go in with a wet paintbrush and scrub away a highlight very easily. So Brusho is very staining. I think it's more like an ink than a watercolor, honestly, but I love using it. And then I use Hydrus watercolors later on, which tend to be more staining as well. You can still lift up some degree of pigment, but you'll never get your bright white paper back. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And it will make your life a little bit easier. Another thing to keep in mind when you are painting this way is the color scheme you're going to use for your painting and what colors you're putting next to each other. So I'm painting really wet and really loose with this picture. And so that means colors are going to overlap. There's water with pigment in it that's going to be spreading all over the paper. And so for this one, I chose to use an analogous color scheme. That means the colors are next to each other on the color wheel. So you have blue and you have red, and together they make purple. And I am using blues, purples, and reds, specifically cool toned reds that are more pink. They're closer to purple, they're closer to blue on the color wheel. And that means it doesn't matter how these colors will layer up. It doesn't matter what color's underneath. When I put another layer of paint down, they're going to play nicely together. That doesn't mean in the future you can't use other more complicated color schemes, but when you're learning a new technique, sometimes it's best to simplify other factors so that you can get those techniques down and get comfortable with them before you add other tricky factors like colors that tend to turn gray or neutralize each other when mixed together. So just something to keep in mind. If you are seeing me add a color to this paper and I'm not sprinkling Brusho directly onto it, I am just getting it off of my palette, and they're Hydrus watercolors, so they are a liquid watercolor that I've just diluted or mixed onto this paper. Now when I've added masking fluid throughout this process, every time I've added it, I have made sure to concentrate it into the areas where I see highlights on my reference photo. So on this reference photo, you can see most of the highlights are along the brow bone, right along the teeth, and then on the right side of the top of the skull. And so that's where I'm putting most of the masking fluid because that's where I want it to stay the brightest. And now I'm going in with some dark blues to start making those shadow areas. Now, usually I try to have my palette that I mix off of visible when I'm painting so that you can see and follow along easier. But for me, this was a temporary setup in my master bedroom. I just had a little folding table set up and I had my tripod balanced on top of it, and I was painting between the legs of the tripod. And so the paint palette was kind of clear off to the side, so I couldn't film both of them at the same time. It's been an adventure. We moved a couple years ago, and our house didn't have space for an art studio at the time, and it sat empty for a lot of years. And so I've been doing a lot of home remodeling and projects that way. So it feels really good to get back into painting. And this was a day where I'd missed watercolor. I've been painting murals. I've done murals inside my house, and I've been teaching art, but I hadn't done a project just for me or in a sketchbook or anything for months. And so I was like, I'm just going to set something up and I'm going to paint. And that's what I did. So this was just me getting back into the flow of painting. Now to get back to what I'm doing on the painting. So I'm pre-wetting areas, I'm dropping in color, and I'm really starting to develop some more of the values and the shape of this skull. So I'm looking at where the shadows are, the shapes of those shadows, and then really reinforcing that on the painting itself. One thing to keep in mind is looking at where you've put color. So where I've put most of the pink on this painting is actually where the highlights are. So where I'm putting subtle shadows in those highlighted areas, I am shadowing it with more of a red violet and darker pink colors so that it goes with the color of that highlighted area, which is more of the pinks. And then where I want the deeper, darker shadows to be, I'm sticking with my dark blues, my navy blues, or like a dark violet color. I'm also applying my paint in the direction of the curve of the skull. So the top of the skull curves around. So I'm making sure my brush strokes match that curve. That's just going to help give more depth. It's going to help give more shape to the painting. So when you're painting something, look, or you're drawing something with a pencil, look at the direction the fur on an animal's body is flowing, because it's following their bone structure. Look at how the hair is curving and make your strokes or your colored lines follow that direction, and that will help give your object more shape. And I'm doing that same thing with my paintbrush, and I also did it with the masking fluid. You can see how the masking fluid curves around the top of the skull, or it is more concave along the upper jaw, or I would say upper lip, but a skull doesn't have lips, but it's following the curvature of the face. And you want your brush strokes to do the same thing. There's been a few times throughout this painting that you've seen me sprinkle stuff onto wet paint, and that is kosher salt. You can use any kind of salt. Different size salt granules will create different textures, but what happens is when you sprinkle salt onto wet paint, wet watercolor specifically, it will create kind of like a star or textured pattern. It works best with granulating colors. You can really get like a frosted or snowflake effect doing that. With staining colors, you get a little bit, but it's not as much because the paint stains the paper before the salt can fully react. But I do add it to this picture just to help add a little bit more texture and a little bit more interest to the painting. And whatever size salt you have will work. Just the different size of granules will create different textures. So something fun to experiment with as you paint. So some information on the supplies I'm using. I am using Transon paintbrushes. These are a goat hair, natural hair paintbrush that I bought off of Amazon a couple years ago. And I really like the set, so much that I bought a second set. They're really inexpensive. I have a review. You can watch it here. They have gone up a little bit in price since I bought them, but I've found them on sale fairly regularly. But I love these paintbrushes. They're kind of my go-to now. I pull them out more than my more expensive brushes. Since these ones are inexpensive, I also take them with me when I am traveling or I'm going to go teach, just because I don't have to fret about them. But they have a nice size range, they hold a nice point, and they hold quite a bit of water. So if you're interested in paintbrushes that are a little bit more affordable to get you started, those are a great option. I don't have affiliate links. I'm not getting paid to say that. It's just something I genuinely like, and you see me use it in a lot of my videos. The paper I'm using is Fabriano Artistico 100% cotton watercolor paper in cold press. So cold press means it has texture. Hot press paper means it's been ironed out and it's really smooth and allows you to get a lot of detail in. Rough press paper is really lumpy and bumpy, and it allows a lot of texture and a lot of granulation to shine in your picture. So this is kind of the middle of the road. I find that Fabriano Artistico paper isn't as textured. Their cold press paper isn't as textured as something like Arches, but it is a little bit more textured than Strathmore 400 or like a Canson XL paper. I've really liked this paper. It's 100% cotton paper, which means it holds onto moisture really well. So it's like when you're walking through a puddle and the bottom of your jeans get wet and they stay wet for hours and hours and hours. That is how cotton paper is. It will hold on to that moisture and then give you a long working time to really do washes of color and really build it up. Whereas a wood pulp paper tends to dry a little bit quicker. It doesn't hold on to the moisture as well. So just something to keep in mind. Also, 100% cotton paper is really expensive. So use what you can afford. I love 100% cotton paper, but I don't even use it all the time because I'm trying out something, I'm kind of warming up, I'm doing a sketch. There's all different reasons why you don't need to use 100% cotton paper all the time. Yes, it will make a difference, but when you're first figuring out how to paint and you're trying new techniques and things like that, you're probably not even going to notice the difference as much because you're still focused on color mixing and brush control and all of those other things, okay? I would recommend using something like a Strathmore 400 paper because that paper can handle all the washes of color. It can handle the masking fluid, and it can handle lots of water. That's actually the paper I first kind of developed this technique on. But for other things, you can use an even less expensive paper. Just make sure it's something that isn't going to break apart and get holes in it, or have the paper like peel and like get like lumps and bumps on it as you paint. There's been some really inexpensive watercolor paper that I've tried out that I think they were lying when they said it was watercolor paper. It was just thick like cardstock, because more than a little bit of water on it, and the paper just totally broke apart. So that's my rant on paper. Use what you can afford and have fun painting. When you are watching this video, you'll notice that I'll use multiple different spray bottles. There's like 3 different spray bottles I use. I switch through them because they give different spray patterns. And so one's more misting and it is a more even spread of water. Some give a better splatter effect. Some do different, I don't know how to describe it, just different sprays and mistings of water. And so it just creates different textures when I paint. So you'll see me go back and forth with different spray bottles, and that is why, because I like the way some spray for different techniques than others. I just kind of collect random spray bottles I find. Sometimes I've used old hairspray bottles just because I like the way they sprayed and the spray pattern that they made. Now I am covering my skull with a piece of paper, and then I'm splattering some paint on the background just to give it a little bit more texture and almost give kind of that star pattern. Then I let that dry 100%. You do not want to do this next step with any kind of moisture on your paper. So you don't want it cool to the touch, you want it bone dry. And then I took something called a rubber pickup, or like a rubber cement eraser, and I'm rubbing that all over my paper to remove the masking fluid that I have so liberally applied to this picture in layers. I find that the rubber pickup or the rubber cement eraser makes that process a lot more enjoyable, faster, and easier. You can find them online. You can find them in art stores. If you don't have one, you can get a clean cloth and kind of wrap it around your finger and rub it on your paper, and that will rub the masking fluid off. You can use your bare finger, but I found that any watercolor paint that is left on that masking fluid can smudge, just from the moisture that can happen naturally on your finger. And it makes your finger kind of tired if you've used a lot of masking fluid, like I did with this piece. You do want to make sure you get all the masking fluid off the paper, because it will turn yellow with time. But once I removed all that masking fluid, I admired all of those beautiful bright highlights from the white paper that we had preserved. And now I am just tweaking and adjusting. So you can see all the layers of paint that we've protected. So there was the bright white highlights at the beginning, and then there's like softer pinks and light blues. Those are all from those early layers of masking fluid that we put down. And you can see how we created different kinds of textures, like more polka dotted and spotted texture on the eye sockets versus more of like a cross-hatching pattern on the skull itself. But it just creates really interesting textures and highlights and kind of this fun illustrative style of a painting. Then once I removed all that masking fluid, I am tweaking and adjusting those values, because some of those colors were a little too light for what I needed them to be. And so I'm just taking diluted paint and just knocking those values down a little bit, adding a little bit of pale pink to them. I'm darkening up shadows where I want them to be a little bit darker, and just doing those final tweaks and adjustments. So I'm seeing where I want the highlights to stand out a little bit more, so I'm darkening up the areas next to it. So I want the skull to stand out a little bit more from the background, so I am darkening up the background so the bright highlight that goes around the whole skull is brighter, and it has a higher contrast and stands out more. That is something to keep in mind, is if you have something that's bright white and it is not showing up the way you want it to show up, and you can't go any wider than what it is, that means the values of the colors next to it need to darken. Or in contrast, If you are like using black paint straight from the tube and it's still not dark enough, then you need to make the values that will be next to that area lighter, and that will make that other area read darker in your picture so you can get that whole spectrum of value. If you are feeling stuck and you don't quite know what needs to be darkened or what needs to be lightened up or tweaked or adjusted, I really recommend taking a picture of your painting on your phone, then editing it so that you turn the saturation way, way down so that it is just black and white. And that will really help you gauge what things are kind of mushing together and what things have high contrast and where something needs to be tweaked and adjusted. And you can also, desaturate your reference photo and have that black and white as well so that you can compare the two, and then you can better adjust your painting as needed. Sometimes we get distracted by color and we forget about value. So just a handy trick when you are painting. Also, taking a break from your picture and coming back at it with fresh eyes, especially if you're starting to feel frustrated, is a good rule of thumb, especially with watercolor, because it's harder to fix mistakes with watercolor than it is with acrylic paint. And now I'm just taking a really small paintbrush with a really fine point to it, and I'm adding all the little details. So like where the cranial sutures are, where the different plates of the skull meet, and it creates those little cracks that you see. I'm using a really small paintbrush to do that. I'm also making sure my paper is 100% dry. If you are trying to get really fine details in, you do not want your paper to be wet because your watercolor will flow wherever there's water. So if your paper is damp or wet, when you add your paint to that paper, your paint will spread out. So as you're getting more detailed and as you are refining your picture more and more, the less water you'll be using on your actual paper. And that will allow you to have more control. So at this stage of the painting, I want this paper bone dry. I'm also making sure to match my paint to the color I'm working in. So if I am painting in an area that has a lot more pinks in it, I am doing a more pink or red-violet color in that section. And then when I move to an area that is in more of the blue values, or the blue colors, I am using blue paint in that area. So keep in mind where you're painting and what color you're picking up from. And we are on the home stretch. We are almost done with this picture. This was a really fun painting to kind of get back in the habit of painting with watercolor. I hope you found it helpful. And since I have painted this picture, I now have a full dedicated art studio again, which means I can paint without destroying my whole bedroom, and I can film content again. And I'm really, really excited to be back at it. I have a whole list of projects that I am working on, and I can't wait to share them with you. So if you would like to see beginner and intermediate tutorials for watercolor and soft pastel, if you want to see product reviews and all that kind of fun stuff, please make sure you hit the follow button and notification bell so that you can follow along more easily. And I hope to see you around. Have a great day. Bye.